Got it. Okay. Okay, I think we're ready. So, welcome everyone to our presentation tonight with Brad Edmondson, who's written a fantastic book, A Wild Idea: How the Environmental Movement Tamed the Adirondacks. And his book is based on interviews with dozens of insiders who are central to this not so kind of easy story of the birth of the Adirondack Park Agency. And so, there's some kind of shocking revelations in there. This book is about state power, the impact that parks can have on rural residents. And in fact, there was a little bit of pushback maybe to creating the park. So, we live in interesting times, and the Adirondacks are such a famous park, not only in this region, but, kind of throughout the country, that it's interesting to know the use of public land versus kind of private residents' needs. So Brad is the author also of Environmental Affairs in New York State. He wrote Ice Cream Social and Post-War Cornell. So you can, he has a website called bradedmondson.com, so you should check that out. But we're delighted to have him, and I'm just going to spotlight you so that my screen won't keep coming back to me if I cough. And I think everybody else is muted. So welcome, Brad, and thank you very much for speaking with us here at the Irish American Heritage Museum. I'll turn it over.
Thank you for inviting me, Elizabeth, and thank you all for tuning in. Yes, I am an independent journalist based in Ithaca, and I've been investigating the origins of the Adirondack Park Agency for a good long time, almost 20 years. The book was timed to come out with the 50th anniversary of the Adirondack Park Agency. And I've got a little slide presentation queued up here. I hope I'll be able to share it with you. Let's see if it goes. So let's see here. Hopefully you can see the cover of the book now. The thing that is being commemorated, the thing that happened 50 years ago, is that a state law was passed that created the Adirondack Park Agency and ordered it to do two things: to write two plans, one plan for the state forest preserve and one plan for the privately owned land that is inside the boundary of the Adirondack Park. These two plans became law in 1972 and 1973. And I think from the perspective of 50 years on, it's not very controversial to say that these two plans have been as important to the Adirondack Park as the formation of the park itself in 1892 and the addition of the forever wild clause to the New York State Constitution in 1894. And in the next half hour, I'm going to explain why the APA was so important and how all that came to pass, including what all those terms I just said mean. If you don't know much about the Adirondack Park, those terms might not have meant something to you, but I'll get to all of that. So this is really a book about land use planning. And land use planning is ordinarily considered a boring topic. I'm a reporter, started my career at newspapers, and land use planning is a topic that my editors would refer to as MIGO, which is an acronym that means my eyes glaze over. It's not something that generally is considered dramatic, but this is a very dramatic story. And there are two reasons for that. One is that the plan relied on ideas that were entirely new at the time and had never been tested on such a vast scale. A lot of people don't realize how big the Adirondack Park is. A lot of people who even live inside the Adirondack Park don't realize how big it is. This illustration shows you that the park, which is the highlighted area inside of New York State, is the same size as the state of Vermont. So this plan was really a proof of concept run for the idea of environmental impact statements, and it was done on a vast scale. And the other reason why this is quite a dramatic story is that this was a huge imposition of state power on a deeply rural area. And most of the local residents of the park did not like that one bit. They didn't feel like they were being listened to. And so they reacted in the only way they could, by staging protests that eventually became violent. Now, the big idea that's behind this story is the forever wild clause. And even if you have heard of the forever wild clause, you may not be aware of how very unusual it is. It's an article of New York State's Constitution, and it makes it illegal to cut down even a single tree on state-owned land in the Adirondacks without passing a statewide referendum that takes 2 years to set up. It is an extreme level of protection of the state-owned land. And from the beginning, people have, a small but very dedicated group of people have been willing to step forward and challenge any deviation from that language in court. The forever wild clause is very clear, very specific. And when someone challenges it and says, well, maybe it's okay to cut this tree over here or bend this road this way over here, there have always been people who are willing to come forward in court and say, no, actually, the letter of the law says this, and the judges reading the law say, yes, in fact, that is what it says. You can't cut down that tree. So recently, if you're up on Adirondack News, there was a recent decision about snowmobile connector trails between rural communities, where the Department of Environmental Conservation negotiated with local towns in the Adirondacks to allow essentially 12-foot wide roads to be cut through the forest preserve to connect snowmobiles from one town to another. And an environmental organization stepped forward, took that plan to court, and the court said, the forever wild clause is pretty clear. You can't cut down those trees. And it threw the whole plan into disarray, and it became a huge controversy because the Department of Environmental Conservation promised something that was beyond the boundaries of the forever wild clause. So the difference, the reason why the APA is so important is that before the APA was set up, the forever wild clause wasn't really taken seriously. It wasn't really enforced. So you might say that 50 years ago, the Adirondacks truly became a park. So as I said, I've been on this story for a long time. I started it in 2002, and when I started it was an oral history project. It was not intended to be a book. And the first person I interviewed 18 years ago was this fellow. His name is Clarence Petty, and he is shown in 1973 at the age of 68. He was a really great place to start this project because his career is sort of a through line of 20th century Adirondack history. Clarence was born in 1905 on state land in a squatter's cabin on Upper Saranac Lake. And when he was 2 or 3 years old, his father, who was a guide, a licensed guide for hunters and fishermen in the park, moved the family onto a legal plot of land a few miles away from Saranac Lake. And Clarence lived almost his entire life on that spot. He died at the age of 105 in the year 2009. And you've probably either heard from your parents or have had this told to you by your grandparents that kids today have it so easy. Back in my day, we walked to school in the snow. Clarence Petty and his brother actually did walk to school in the snow, and it was 18 miles one way through the Adirondack Forest Preserve, the deep woods, from their house to the village of Saranac Lake. And on Sunday nights, on Sundays, they would walk 18 miles to Saranac Lake, board in the village while they took their lessons during the week. And then on Friday, they would walk 18 miles back to the family house so that they could do their chores on Saturday. And that's just the way it was in the Adirondacks in the beginning of the 20th century. And he lived until the year 2009. So he saw an enormous amount of change, and he participated in more or less every phase of this story. Clarence was a state forest ranger, but in his heart, he was an Adirondack kid who loved nothing more than exploring the backcountry. And the story really begins in 1959 when he got a dream assignment. In 1959, the federal government was working on a legal definition of the word wilderness. And they were trying to figure out, of all of the open space that they owned in the national parks and the national forests, what could be considered untouched land that would be unimproved and would be kept for its natural qualities. A New York State commission sort of caught this fever and funded an effort to map the areas of the Adirondacks that could qualify legally as wilderness areas. And really what this meant was that the legislative committee hired Clarence Petty and a friend of his named Neil Stout. And the two men spent 3 years flying over and walking through almost every acre of the 2.4 million acre forest preserve. They found about 800,000 acres that would legally qualify as wilderness, which is an area that's untouched by man, is the legal term, part of the definition. And that could increase to 1 million acres of the Adirondacks, which would be wilderness, if the conservation department just took down a few cabins and closed a few roads. So Clarence and Neil reported their findings to the guy in this slide who's holding out his dinner plate. That is Watson Pomeroy. And Watson Pomeroy is a state assemblyman, represented Poughkeepsie. He was chair of the legislative committee that sent these guys out. At this time, citizens groups were putting pressure on legislators to do something about the Adirondacks, but they were pretty small, pretty fringy groups in the late 50s, early 60s. There was the Adirondack Mountain Club, which was a club for hikers. There was the Conservation Council, which was a club for hunters. And there were a few sort of bird watchers and romantics who were passionate about defending the forever wild clause. And they thought that nature should be protected for its own sake. But this was an idea way off on the fringe in 1960. But Clarence Petty believed in it. He, as far back as 1960, he believed that the Adirondack Forest Preserve should just be completely left alone because he saw almost religious qualities in the wilderness. And he thought it was almost sacrilegious to disturb it. And he turned Assemblyman Pomeroy into someone who agreed with this point of view, a forever wilder, they were called, by taking him on camping trips like the one pictured in this slide. So what I found when I was investigating this story was really, it was very interesting, is when you actually interview the people who were responsible for making the change, and you get past the minutes and the documents and the bills and all the this and the that, the stuff that's written down, you find out that what really drives social changes like this one are personal relationships. And the relationship between Clarence Petty and Watson Pomeroy was one of the things that moved wilderness protection from way out on the fringe to somewhere closer to the mainstream. Another relationship that was extremely important in the story was a relationship between Nelson Rockefeller, who's the guy on horseback on the right, and his brother Lawrence, who's the guy in the center. They're on a camping trip in 1965 in the high peaks of the Adirondacks. They're riding up Cold River on an overnight trip. The guy on the left is Bill Petty, who is also a forest ranger, Clarence's older brother. Bill Petty was the other guy who walked 18 miles to school one way in the snow. And Clarence and Bill were both state forest rangers. So Nelson Rockefeller, of course, is the governor of New York. He was probably the most powerful governor in New York's history. And he was a leader of a very small group of men who had enormous power in the early 60s. If you're old enough to remember, people used to call this group the establishment, and they used to blame things on the establishment because there was a very small group of men. They had a lot of power. Their power wasn't often questioned, and they would just get together and decide things. and Nelson Rockefeller was one of them because he was the governor. Lawrence Rockefeller was also a member of the establishment. He was not an elected official. He was a businessman turned philanthropist. And his passion was creating national parks. That was something that Lawrence's father had gotten into, and the Rockefeller family had played a direct role in creating about a half a dozen national parks in the United States. These parks wouldn't have happened without infusions of Rockefeller cash and expertise. Lawrence was a main mover in these efforts. It was his passion. He had a great deal to do with the passage of the Federal Wilderness Act in 1964, the Federal Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was passed in 1965, and on and on. So Lawrence Rockefeller in 1967 decided that it would be a great idea if the Adirondacks could be turned into a national park. And so he released a report, really without even talking to anyone else first. I think he told his brother what he was up to, but he didn't really tell anybody else. And he released this report as a private citizen, but since he was Lawrence Rockefeller, it got a lot of attention. And you see in this map, the large boundary is the boundary of the Adirondack Park, the blue line. The smaller green boundary inside that is the land that Lawrence Rockefeller wanted to set aside and give to the federal government as a national park. It was the choicest bits of Adirondack real estate, most of the high peaks, the most beautiful lakes. And the idea was that this land would be turned over to the federal government, and it would become the nation's third largest national park. So in New York politics, consensus is a very hard thing to achieve. It almost never happens. But consensus did happen instantly in response to this idea. Everyone in New York hated this idea. The hunters hated it because hunting is not allowed in national parks. The people who own the 600,000 acres of private land that would be bought out by the federal government through eminent domain if necessary didn't want to give up their land. The villages of Lake Placid, Tupper Lake, Saranac Lake, and several other places would become basically protectorates of the National Park Service, and the townships that all had elected officials would basically cease to exist. So they were all opposed to it. But even if you didn't have a direct hand in, even if you weren't going to be directly affected by this plan, it offended New Yorkers' sensibilities. You know, the plan was basically saying, hey, New York, you can't handle this. You'd better turn it over to the national, to the federal government, because you're doing a bad job. And New Yorkers all said, we disagree. We think this is a great asset. It's a state asset. And we think that we can do a better job than the federal government can. So Lawrence Rockefeller, being a very savvy person, essentially said, okay, if you think that, why don't you come up with a plan for the Adirondacks that will protect it from all of the dangers that it's facing? And, you know, Nelson Rockefeller loved big, bold, cutting edge plans. And he also loved his brother. But he needed a way to squash this kerfuffle that his brother had created, while also dealing with the legitimate issues that his brother had raised. So he set up a commission. Nelson Rockefeller loved commissions. He loved study groups. He loved to get smart people together in a room and throw a complex problem at them and give them the money to research possible solutions and test things out and then come up with recommendations. He loved that more than anything else. Except being president. He really wanted to be president of the United States. That's what he wanted the most. But he used to set up all these commissions. He set up 13 commissions just in the year 1968. And one of them was the Temporary Study Commission on the Future of the Adirondacks. It was basically 11 members of the establishment who were told in very broad terms to study the Adirondack Park and come up with recommendations for its long-term preservation. And the Adirondack Park had problems in the late 1960s. There were a lot of illegal roads, illegal camps, in the forest preserve. Clarence Petty and Neil Stout had found these in the early 1960s and documented them, but nothing had been done about them. The campgrounds were overcrowded. There was trash piling up on the roadsides. But worst of all, this was an era in the late 1960s when developers would come into rural areas, buy big tracts of rural land, carve them up into individual home plots, and sell them one at a time as vacation home sites. And this was happening in Arizona, it was happening in Florida, it was happening in southern Vermont, and it was wreaking havoc on these rural areas that suddenly were home to potentially thousands of people building homes and demanding services, and these governments couldn't handle that problem. So something needed to be done before developments on that scale took root in the Adirondacks, and that was really why the Temporary Study Commission was started. Now, usually when a politician starts a commission, he's trying to sweep a problem under the rug and get it off his desk. But that was not Nelson Rockefeller. This is a famous photograph of Rockefeller in front of his legacy project, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. He cleared 98 acres of downtown Albany, raised 1,200 buildings, spent the equivalent of 11 or 13 billion dollars to build the Empire State Plaza. And he always called himself a frustrated builder. He loved grand schemes. And more than anything else, he wanted to be president of the United States. So here's the Adirondacks. And in 1967, an interstate highway had just opened that connected Albany to Canada. The Northway, it's called. And Lawrence Rockefeller wanted to remake the Adirondack Park sort of in the same modern jet age spirit of the interstate highway system. Americans loved to drive directly to places in their cars with as few stops as possible. And what Lawrence wanted to do was he wanted to open up the Adirondack Park so that there could be a direct road to a beautiful lake, a big parking area there, some picnic grounds, perhaps playing fields, maybe a snack bar, campgrounds, campfire presentations, national park stuff. This was really popular, and Americans really needed more national park land in the late 1960s. It wasn't a bad idea at all, but it ran smack dab into the Forever Wild clause and the people who were willing to defend it. And so it got nowhere. And the tension between the people who wanted the Adirondacks to be open to the maximum number of visitors in cars, the sort of national park idea, and the Forever Wild idea played out on the Temporary Study Commission. There were several of Lawrence Rockefeller's men on the commission, but there were also several strong defenders of the Forever Wild clause. And the guy who is most important, this is the Temporary Study Commission presenting its report to the governor. And I'll get to a lot of the faces in this picture, but the guy who is most important to the story is the guy who's standing in the back at the extreme right, the very clean-cut guy with a strong jawline looking directly at the camera. That is Harold Gerry. And Harold Gerry was a planner for the Conservation Department who had been a state senator. He had gone to Princeton and he had gone to Harvard Law School, and he was trusted by Nelson Rockefeller. But Harold Gerry was also a guy from Plattsburgh who had grown up climbing mountains in the Adirondacks and who was completely devoted to a camp that he owned outside of Speculator, 1,500 acres, completely pristine. He went there every weekend of the year. He drove 2 hours from his home in Albany to this camp, he and his wife, Lynn. And he was about as hardcore a Forever Wilder as it got. He didn't want any building at all in the Adirondack backcountry, whether it was publicly or privately owned. He didn't want any buildings at all. And he made sure, he was appointed the staff director of the Temporary Study Commission, not a commissioner, but the director of the staff. And he made sure that all of the staff people who he hired agreed with him about the Forever Wild clause. And the first person Harold Gerry hired was Clarence Petty, because Clarence Petty had recently completed this survey of the forest preserve and he knew more about the forest preserve than any other living person. The second person that Harold Jerry hired was the kid on the right, a 28-year-old graduate student who had just enrolled at Cornell University Natural Resources Department after spending 4 or 5 years as a US Forest Service ranger, a guy named George Davis. And George had enrolled in graduate school because he wanted to study how to balance the natural integrity of ecosystems in the Adirondacks while still allowing people to work and play there. And that was pretty much exactly what Harold Jerry needed for the Temporary Study Commission. So he offered George a whole lot more money than a graduate student would make to study the same question. And George came to Albany and started working for the Temporary Study Commission. Harold Jerry said that the first thing he did was he introduced George Davis to Clarence Petty, and he said to the two of them, "Get out of the office and don't come back," because he wanted them to continue surveying the forest preserve lands to release the most detailed report that had ever been compiled on the Adirondack Forest Preserve. And they spent a year riding around, hiking around, canoeing around, and learning about the forest preserve. George Davis's idea was he wanted to apply a relatively new concept in 1970 that was called carrying capacity. The idea was that you would get data, and you would get data on the soil types, the slopes, the wildlife, the presence of wetlands, and many, many other factors. And you would crunch all that data together, and you would produce a system that could rate the ability of a given site to handle development without degrading the areas around it. That was what George Davis, Clarence Petty, and the staff of the Temporary Study Commission devoted themselves to. They ended up in 14 months producing 800 pages of reports to the commissioners. And the 800 pages were all facts. They were all newly generated information about the economy of the Adirondacks, the wildlife, the forest resources, the water resources, the transportation systems, and so forth and so on. It was the first time that anybody had really surveyed the Adirondacks and produced data to prove, to indicate what should be done. That's one thing that the Temporary Study Commission did. Another thing that happened, I said there was a battle between the National Parks people and the Forever Wild people. The Forever Wild people won that battle. And this is where, this is not a story that touches much on Irish American topics, but there is one character who you probably have heard of if you're in Albany, who was the original chair of the Temporary Study Commission, was Albany's former Congressman Leo O'Brien, who was a very well-known figure in Albany. And he had been active in the national park system as a congressman. And Nelson Rockefeller put him in charge because he knew he would be a reliable voice in favor of the national park model for the Adirondacks. Well, Leo O'Brien soon found that he was over his head. He couldn't keep up with the staff. He didn't know what to do with these reams and reams and reams of data that they were producing. And after a year, Leo O'Brien was replaced as the chair of the Temporary Study Commission by this guy, Harold Hochschild. Hochschild was a wealthy, retired mining executive. And Hochschild was actually born on the day the Adirondack Park was signed into law in 1892. You can't make stuff like that up. Hochschild spent as much time as he possibly could at his family's great camp at Blue Mountain Lake. And he loved the Adirondacks so much that he founded and endowed the Adirondack Experience Museum in Blue Mountain Lake, which is a great museum if you've never been there. So needless to say, Harold Hochschild also thought that the Forever Wild Clause was absolutely sacred. And how these two factions sort of had a war that Hochschild and his faction won is another good story that I don't really have time to get into tonight. I tell it in the book, but I also go into it in detail in an article that's going to appear in the next issue of Adirondack Life. So the other thing that happened, besides the Forever Wilders winning the battle of the Temporary Study Commission, during the time that they were compiling this data, they were very fortunate because in the late 1960s, while they were working away, the national environmental movement absolutely blew up. And if you're old enough, I don't think Elizabeth has a firsthand memory of this, but some of the others do. If you remember Earth Day in 1970, I was 11 years old, but I remember that there was a tremendous amount of passion in the air. There was a tremendous amount of concern about pollution that had blown up very suddenly. And people were just really worried about the fate of the planet. New York City was the epicenter of Earth Day. And if you needed the votes of people who lived in New York City to get reelected, you had to have really strong environmental positions, or you would not get reelected in the early 1970s. So the Temporary Study Commission released its report at the beginning of 1971. This is the front page of the Sunday New York Times for January 3rd, 1971. And you can see, if you're an old newspaper reporter, you know that being on the front page on the left side above the fold is the most important story in the newspaper. And that picture that you're looking at is a picture of an Adirondack Lake. And you can see below the headline, "New Policy Urged for the Adirondacks," the most important story in the New York Times that day. The Temporary Study Commission made 181 recommendations. And recommendation number one was the most important of them. They ranked them. And that called for a new state agency that would have a great deal of authority over the use of land inside the blue line and would write these two big master plans. And this was indeed a wild idea in 1971. One reason was that land use decisions are almost always made by town and village and local governments. Home rule is a big idea in New York State, that the localities have rights which are reserved to them, and one of them is zoning. And the idea that the state would step in and essentially take over the zoning of 6 million acres of the state and 101 towns and villages would no longer have the controlling authority over land use was a very, very radical proposal. The second was the scope of it. You know, as I said, the Adirondacks is as big as Vermont. The public lands, 2.4 million acres of the Adirondacks, were as large as Yellowstone National Park, scattered all over the 6 million acre park. The private lands, which were intermixed with the public lands, that was as much acreage as the state of Connecticut. So writing these two plans was not going to be a simple matter. And there were many, many reasons why the bill in 1971 could have failed. But Nelson Rockefeller really wanted it to happen, and he was very lucky. He introduced the bill to establish the Adirondack Park Agency just a couple of weeks before this commercial dropped to national television. Let's see if we can make this play for you. Here you go.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
So that commercial is called The Crying Indian, and it's the most successful public service announcement that was ever made in the history of television. People went absolutely nuts for this ad. They were already primed with a great deal of concern about pollution and the protection of the national environment. And when I remember I was 11 years old when this commercial came out, and my older brother was 13. We lived in Florida. And my Boy Scout troop immediately started going out and picking up litter off of roadsides. And that happened all over the United States. I mean, it's hard to, if you don't remember it personally, it's hard to really capture the degree of passion that people felt for environmental protection then. So the law passed. And that was how George Davis, at the age of 28, found himself alone in a log cabin in a remote village of Raybrook in the Adirondack Park that the Department of Environmental Conservation had recently abandoned and was planning to burn down until the Adirondack Park Agency was established. And they said, oh, you can have this. So George Davis tells this story about his first day at work. He says the DEC headquarters had just gone up, a new headquarters building had just gone up next door. So he went to DEC and he got the key to the log cabin from some guy. And he opened the door and he went in. He was absolutely alone. There was nothing in the building, no furniture, no heat, no telephones, no nothing. But George, this was his first day at work, and he really felt like he needed to get started. He had a lot to do. So he went back to DEC and he found out from the guy that you could use something called a purchase order to buy stuff in town. You didn't need cash. So he got a purchase order and he went into Saranac Lake and he bought 2 big cartons of toilet paper. And he brought them back and he used one of the cartons for his desk and he used one of the cartons for his chair. And when the phones were hooked up, he put his phone on one of the cartons, he put his coffee pot in the carton. And that was the Adirondack Park Agency for about a month. It was just this guy and 2 cartons of toilet paper. And that's a funny story, but it's also kind of an ominous story because of what George Davis was being asked to do. Write these 2 enormous plans that nobody had ever attempted anything that ambitious before, and do them both in 14 months. It happened, the agency was set up during a severe budget crisis, so it didn't get very much money. And as I said, it was under a lot of time pressure. And it had one thing going for it, which was that the guy who was the visionary, the one who was drafting the plan, was 29 years old. He was too young to understand that what he had been asked to do was impossible. And so he just went ahead and did it. He reported to 9 board members. And the most important ones were Peter Payne and Richard Lawrence, who had both served on the Temporary Study Commission. And really, they didn't have very much supervision up there. People in Albany weren't paying much attention. It was really more like a tech startup, a 1971 version of a tech startup company. It was very conceptual, very mission-driven. They were figuring things out as they went. They had a goal, but they didn't really have a clear way of getting there. They were developing essentially lots and lots of new ideas on the fly. And like a lot of startup companies, the rules were looser than you might think for a state agency. George was very proud to tell me that there was a refrigerator in the back of this log cabin that he kept stocked with beer at all times. And he paid for the beer out of the state's budget. And there were, sort of unwritten rules about the beer. You couldn't start drinking as soon as you came in the morning. But if you came in from doing some field work in the afternoon, you could have a beer. If you were taking a cigarette break, you could have a beer. And if you were working evenings or weekends, which people did, routinely, because time was so short, you could drink beer at your desk. If you think about a state agency where people are encouraged to drink beer at their desk, it was a different time. But as I said, they had an enormous amount of work to do. And in fact, they realized that it was impossible pretty early on. They asked Nelson Rockefeller for another year. He had said that you had to turn this in for the 1973 legislative session. And they said, there's no way we can do that. Can't we have until 1974? Rockefeller said, no, it's going to happen in 1973 or it's not going to happen at all. So things got really pretty crazy by the end of the process. And George remembers the day before they absolutely had to turn in these gigantic detailed maps that they had been compiling of all of the conditions on all of the land. And he and a colleague did an all-nighter. They got up at 4 a.m. and they worked all day. And the Adirondack Park takes about 2.5 hours to drive from one end to the other. So after their workday, they had a 2-hour drive back to the office. They got back to the office around midnight, and everyone who was on the payroll was in the office at midnight because they had to take the materials that George and Anita had discovered that day and revise the maps before they could be given to the commissioners. So the whole staff pulled an all-nighter, loaded the maps into the car, and then drove them 90 miles to the commission's meeting in Lake George at 10 o'clock in the morning, a 30-hour workday. And that was sort of the spirit of the early Adirondack Park Agency. This is the map that they produced. This is the map as it was in 1973. And again, I don't have the time to really go into detail about the 6 different categories of land use, the many regulations on lakefronts and other things. But the general idea is to channel development and building into the areas around the existing settlements. So you see the dark patches on this map. Those are places like Saranac Lake, Lake Placid, Indian Lake, Tupper Lake, that are already cities, are already villages. And in those areas, the Adirondack Park Agency wouldn't have very much jurisdiction at all. The sort of aqua green land is the State Forest Preserve, where no tree cutting of any kind is allowed. The bright green land is called resource management land. It's mostly privately owned forest land with very little building on it. And the park agency said that on this resource management land, there would be a maximum of 1 building on every 43 acres. Another category, the yellow land, is called rural use. And on rural use land, there would be a maximum of 1 building on every 8.5 acres. And I won't go into the gory details, but the important thing is that 85% of the private land in the park was zoned into those 2 most restrictive categories. So we had gone from a region where there was almost no zoning of any kind. And when people had an issue with the government, they thought of the town office, the village office, to all of a sudden a very strict development scheme that was being imposed from Albany. And you can imagine what the people of the Adirondacks thought about it. It was kind of like throwing a lit match into a puddle of gasoline. They weren't given very much time to react. The draft plan for public comment came out in December 1972, and there were public hearings in January of 1973. This is a photograph of the hearing in Saranac Lake, the last in the series. The guy on the right is the chairman of the Adirondack Park Agency, Richard Lawrence, who chaired this meeting, which ran for 8 hours straight without any breaks. There were 800 people in the room. There were state police lined up against the back of the room. And Lawrence later said that the police were terrified because they thought that there was going to be a riot. The people were so angry. But Lawrence held it together and got through these public hearings. And he really wasn't all that bothered by the anger of local people because he didn't really have time to get them on his side. He needed the law passed, and he knew that everyone he needed to impress lived in Albany. So the concerns of the 100,000 people who lived inside the park were ignored by the early APA, and the local people did not forget that. So after these hearings, the APA made about 500 revisions that took care of a lot of objections, specifically objections from powerful people who were in a position to scuttle the law. And they stood aside because there was also a general realization that the Adirondacks needed better protection. And Nelson Rockefeller signed the law into existence the private land plan in May of 1973. So that's basically the story. I just want to say two things in conclusion. One is that there's no way that this could happen today in the way it happened in the early 70s for a couple of reasons. One is that the public does not trust elected officials to solve problems now as much as they did then. And they're also less willing to accept these big, complicated top-down government solutions, which makes it even more amazing that this 6 million acre land use plan is still the law and it's still basically intact. The reason why that is that the Adirondack Park Agency is entirely a creation of the governor. He controls the board membership, he controls the budget, and it doesn't have anything to do with the state legislature. And every governor of New York, from Nelson Rockefeller on down, has been kept in line and has honored the Forever Wild Clause and the Wild Adirondack concept because of this citizens movement, which has existed unbroken since the creation of the park, to protect and preserve the Forever Wild Clause, and the widespread support for that concept among the voters of New York State. The local people really were in the vast minority. The population of New York was 19 million in the early 1970s, and there are only 100,000 people who lived inside the park. But in the long run, the Adirondack Park Agency really weakened themselves by not paying attention to the concerns of local people, because the opposition was entrenched and very enthusiastic, very committed, and they essentially caused the state officials to spend all their time fighting local opposition instead of building the partnerships that they were hoping to build to eventually get local control of land use plans through. And the plan was sort of all brains and no heart, in the words of one critic. It was the work of a scientifically minded ecologist and planner who was working with cutting edge concepts, but really didn't reach out to local people and ask them what they wanted out of their towns and villages. He didn't see that, George Davis didn't see that as an important thing. And that was a serious flaw, because you can't really have the support of, you can't really protect large landscapes without having the support of the people who live there. And I think in the long run, that's what the story of the APA tells us. So just one more thing, and that is that even though the Adirondack Park Agency could have done a better job, and there's no way that it could happen now in the way that it happened then, the idea behind the Adirondack Park Agency, the idea of what's now called landscape level conservation, which is protecting the natural integrity of very large landscapes, 6 million acres in the case of the Adirondacks, but basically intact ecosystems and intact forests, large unbroken forests. That idea is incredibly important because it's one of the most effective ways to control climate change is to protect large intact natural areas. They're great mitigators of carbon in the atmosphere. They store tons and tons of carbon. And there's lots and lots of support for the idea of landscape level conservation. This is a map of the state of Florida. And last week, or I think 2 weeks ago now, the Florida legislature, which is not a bunch of progressive Democrats, let me tell you, they just, in a bipartisan vote, at which the governor signed, they agreed to spend $400 million this year to protect open space in the state of Florida. And the big idea behind this program, which is called Forever Florida, is to link natural areas in Florida as wildlife corridors, which will protect the natural integrity of Florida ecosystems and protect Florida's wildlife, but it will also ensure a supply of fresh water for 19 million people who now live in the state of Florida. And it will give Floridians a place to enjoy nature, and while mitigating a great deal of carbon in the atmosphere. And if you take out the carbon argument, those other three arguments, protection of natural integrity, protection of water supply, and recreation in nature, those were the exact reasons why the Adirondack Park was created in 1892. And the public has always been enthusiastic about having government do this. So was the APA a one-off? Yes and no. Couldn't happen again in the same way. Certainly could have been done better. But it was still an amazing accomplishment. And if we can find a way to do it right and take the concerns of local people into account, it might be seen as an important precursor to what's going to get us out of this mess. And so that's pretty much the prepared comments I have. I'd be happy to take your questions if you have any. Let me get myself back on the screen.
Just stop sharing. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. God, that was great, Brad.
Thank you.
I mean, it's amazing the politics that are involved. I don't think I was thinking in terms of politics or those personalities, and it was reminding me of, you know, Robert Moses in the city, sort of just bulldozing through what people want, you know, in terms of parks.
Robert Moses hated the Forever Wild clause.
I'm sure he did.
He called it. He said that the Adirondacks was nothing more than a nature museum for elitists.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and it's kind of not for elites at all in comparison to what he was doing in terms of, you know, driving out to Long Island and not having buses be able to drive under the bridges, you know. So he did know about elites, but yes, you would think that the Adirondacks were not elite. Yes. So, I mean, can we learn from this? I'm glad you brought up Florida and stuff, but, you know, I'm thinking of the pipelines and the fracking in different, you know, communities. It seems that, you know, government, whether it's state or federal, and local people are at odds more and more, you know, as the years go by. So have you anything that you can contribute about that, or even in terms of like Appalachia or as I say, the pipeline coming down in the Dakotas and things? Is there lessons to be learned from the Adirondacks for those?
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth, if I could give you the answer to that question, if I could solve that problem,
I know, yeah,
I would not be sitting in an empty office in Ithaca, New York. I would be somewhere else. But I can give you one thing that I think something that came through very strongly in my research, which I try to stress in my presentation, is that what people really want more than anything else is they want to feel like they've been listened to, that they've been heard, and that their concerns have been addressed. And that's not to say that that's going to make conflict go away. But what made the conflict in the Adirondacks so hot was a sense of insult that local residents felt from not being consulted. Nobody asked them their opinion, and they felt like it had been rammed down their throats. And I think that for the kind of environmental protection that we're going to have to do if we get a handle on climate change is really going to have to be as much of a as much of a town and village outreach program and a listening program as it is a scientific exercise. It's just not going to work. You know, in the Adirondacks, the state had a great advantage in that there was a law passed in 1912 that said that state authority superseded local authority inside the blue line. That law doesn't exist anywhere else. And so you're not going to get large scale environmental protection from localities that have big open space areas unless you get those localities to buy into the idea.
And can I add, just to kind of bring it right back to the basics, were there concerns because the land use was being changed, like that maybe they couldn't, you know, build a house for their son, or that was principally the problem?
Oh, very much
Yeah.
so. In fact, in the draft that was released to the public, it wasn't clear that your children could inherit your land, or that your son or daughter could build a house on your land. Yeah. And the staff just hadn't thought about it. You know, they literally, you know, many of them were quite open with me about this. It just didn't occur to them that that might be a concern for the people who lived in the park. And so that was one of the things that was brought up in the public hearings, and the law was changed to make it clear that that your children could inherit your land, and that you could subdivide land to make it possible for a family member to build there.
Mm-hmm.
But the outreach in the public relations was very poor. And so a lot of rumors took root and spread like wildfire, and added to this sense of insult. It made it almost impossible for the Adirondack Park Agency to get its message across that the vast majority of people who lived in the park, their lives weren't going to be affected by this law at all.
Mm-hmm. So that fear kind of imminent domain, and I mean, is that still the case now, Brad? Can people, like, can you buy a camp pretty easily off somebody, or can you update a camp, or are there these kind of restrictions?
Well, the law has teeth. The Adirondack Park Agency law does make it more difficult to build in the park, and it makes it more expensive to build in the park. And there are lots of regulations that you have to abide by in order to get a building permit. But it really isn't any more extreme in the Adirondacks than it is in, say, Westchester County.
Okay.
The difference, of course, is that the Adirondacks is not Westchester County, and zoning that is that strict is very rare in an area as rural as the Adirondack Park.
Mm-hmm. We kind of have similar issues in some of the parts of Ireland, along the coast. Like, I'm from County Kerry, and so sometimes there's restrictions on who can build or what type of building you can build, because everybody wants the view. And so,
right.
There was a point like in the 60s and 70s where, local people will tell you, oh, the Germans are coming in and buying up the most beautiful spaces and our kids can't afford. And then, they kind of zoned it so strictly that you had to speak Irish and you had to be a long-term resident. And so, there's a happy medium, I guess, where you're being true to the original, kind of community, but also allowing for a little bit of progress, because maybe otherwise it doesn't move forward.
Absolutely. And this is really the bread and butter work that local officials do every day of their terms. And the Adirondack Park Agency inherited this responsibility, and this massive responsibility, but they were seen as not being from the area. They weren't local. And so they started with, at least one hand tied behind their back. But protecting a community's integrity through land use restrictions is pretty basic to government, and most people accept it now. In 1971, in rural areas, it was a pretty crazy idea.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, Peter's commenting too on Facebook, and don't jump in, everybody here too on Zoom. When you were saying about the car, like that Rockefeller had this idea, like, let's bring in, thousands of people. Peter says in Vermont, the planners want to replace cars with buses, that it's really kind of clueless of how life works for the average person in Vermont. So I suppose in these rural and kind of not densely populated place, a city slicker kind of coming up, or someone that thinks they know, whereas the reality of the situation is so different,
Yeah, well, that is part of it. In the Adirondacks, you mentioned buses. In the Adirondacks, there's currently a great deal of concern about overcrowding at trailheads, and people get to these rural trailheads in private cars, and some of the most popular trailheads are just completely jammed with cars from before dawn. They're full. In peak summer weekends, and then people start parking along the highway, which creates, and then walking along the highway to get to the trail, which creates a pretty serious hazard. So, one of the things that's happening to try to get a handle on this overuse of certain trails is the state is starting to run buses from large remote parking areas to the trailheads. So, it's not a subject that lends itself to generalities. Sometimes buses in rural areas are a great idea.
So does anyone else have a question or comment?
I'd like to say thanks for a lovely evening. That was a great talk. It was very relaxing and easy to listen to, and I'd do it again.
Oh, good.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.
Well, do check out. We have more talks. They're not all this relaxing, I have to say, but but thank you for joining.
Them all. I'm gonna have to go out and get your book now.
Yeah,
Oh, Jim, I appreciate that. I
Yeah.
hope you enjoy it. Thanks
Is
for
it
your comment.
available at the museum?
we're going to buy some copies. I think the book place in Albany have it, but I'm going to get some copies for the museum, Jack. Yeah, and I'll ship it out to you, but I'll let you know. Bob, did
Okay.
you have a question or comment there?
Just to say that it was a great lesson.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it. I was alive for all of those times. The first Earth Day, I was a freshman in high school, so I remember it well. And I actually met Rockefeller when he was governor in 1972 on a campaign stop just north of New York City.
Wow.
And the interesting thing is, to the general public, you thought he was a very imposing figure. He's only about 5'8" or 5'9", and I'm 6'2". So when I met him as this 16-year-old, I was actually surprised at how small he was. But his personality certainly outsized his physical stature. That's for sure.
Mhm.
But he did get a tremendous amount of things done.
Yeah.
And he did it exactly in the style that you said, whether it was the growth of the state university system, the Albany Plaza, the Adirondack Parks. I mean, his fingerprints are all over New York, for better or for worse, for a large number of years.
Yeah.
And I think he was also probably pressured to get that done in '73 because at that point, I think Spiro Agnew had resigned as vice president of the United States.
Precisely.
Go back to the national ambitions you were talking about. He was looking
Yes.
for something bigger, and
Right.
he of course resigned so that Malcolm Wilson could become the governor in 1974.
Yeah. He ran
so
for
there-
president 4 times.
Right. Yeah. He ran, I think, more than Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney's father George did, I think. I think he ran like every election for a good number of years.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but he was really an outsized individual, and he was, at least in my estimation, he was a true moderate, and he would probably be considered a liberal Republican by today's standards for sure. But he was a true moderate, and he was able to get a lot of stuff done because he was a moderate.
Yes, I think that's
Consensus. We remember consensus, but I mean, it is true, Bob, that it was such an interesting story because the politics are amazing, the personalities involved are amazing. And then in a way, as you say, like how progressive some of the environmental stuff turned out to be, because I mean, where we are now, the fires in California, I read an article over the weekend that New York City is experiencing haze because of the fires in the West, which is just, I mean, amazing, so.
Yeah, you can smell the smoke in Ithaca.
Yeah, God, that's just, I mean, that is frightening.
Yeah, it is.
In 1972, I was still in high school, but I became actually an aide to a state senator from the Rockland, Westchester County, Don Ackerson, who was a World War II bomber pilot, and he actually spent time in a stalag as a prisoner of war because they were shot down. But Don Ackerson worked for Union Carbide, but he was a tremendous environmentalist, and he got elected to a state senate term in 1972, and he pushed really hard with Rockefeller administration to put a lot of environmental protections in place in the early 1970s. So having lived through that and actually been part of it, it kind of brought back some memories from today.
Good. Good. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for your attention, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I thought it was great. Does anyone else, just before we pack up, on Facebook have any questions or comments? Or Jack, yeah.
No, I was applauding. I agree with the previous presenter.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, no, there aren't questions. I don't think. I'm refreshing my Facebook page. So, Brad, I think that was brilliant. Definitely the book sounds like a must read. Even the story of the guys walking 18 miles, on a Sunday night to go to school, like, it's incredible,
Yeah,
I mean,
it's amazing what you do when you have no choice.
Yeah. Well, or the fact that they weren't even given the choice, kind of, like that you get to school, of course, and walk 18 miles in the snow, so.
Yeah.
And I bet you they didn't miss many days either,
Yeah. In response, somebody said, can you buy the book at the museum? You can get the book for 30% off. If you go to my website, there's a code that Cornell University Press publishes that gives you 30% off. So if you go to my website, which is either bradedmondson.com or awildidea.com,
Okay.
you'll see the code there that you can use to get the book.
Yeah, that's great.
Get a discount.
I had talked to Book Place, which
Mhm.
are here in Albany or over in Troy. I guess they have a, but it's better to support obviously and get the coupon, than don't buy it online. Is what I would say.
Well, this turns out to be a little bit cheaper than Amazon.
Okay, good.
But the money's going directly to the publisher.
Yeah, which is good.
Okay.
So listen, thank you very much, everyone. If nobody has any other questions or comments, we'll leave it there. I think you probably spoke longer than you anticipated, Brad, but it was great. It was riveting, to be honest. So I'm looking forward to reading it.
I appreciate your attention.
Good. And we're back
Thanks.
on Wednesday with my own talk in the Irish War of Independence series, and then we'll sort of slow down in August.
Okay.
Elizabeth, is that in the museum?
Yeah, that'll be live and on virtual. But we're
Okay.
in the museum, yeah. So
All right.
take care, everyone. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate it, Brad. That was perfect.
Good night.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.